Hey, this is Steven with KnifeTV. We're here at the California Custom Knife Show, hosted by Plaza Cutlery, and we're sitting with Ernest Emerson of Emerson Knives. Is it Emerson Custom Knives? Emerson Knives Incorporated?
I've got
what do you got?
two. I've got Emerson Knives Inc. and Emerson Custom Knives. So.
All right, well, there you go. So, how's the show treating you so far?
Well, the show's been wonderful as usual, and again, it's the Southern California show. There's a lot of enthusiasm in Southern California, and to have a venue like this is just a great opportunity for all the knife makers that are here.
So tell us a little bit about how you started. I'm sure everybody out there who's watching knows the history of Emerson Knives, but for those that maybe are just tuning in for the first time or hearing about Emerson Knives for the first time, why don't you give us a quick background?
Well, I moved out to California as a young man to go to a martial arts school called the Filipino Cali Academy that was run by two gentlemen, Dan Inosanto and Richard Bastillo. And after a time there, they pulled out a knife and said, we're going to start working with some of the bali songs, which was the Filipino kind of national knife, if you will. And as a young student, I had a job, but I wasn't getting paid very much. I've told the story, I didn't even have the money to pay the dues sometimes for the school, and they'd let me clean up the toilets and all that to make up for the money I didn't have to pay for the dues. And they had these bali song knives, and at the time I think Pacific Cutlery, which became Benchmade eventually, was making the bali song knife, and it was like over $100, and there was no way on earth that I could ever afford to pay $100 for anything, because the dues at the academy, they were only $12.50 a month, and I couldn't afford that sometimes. But I did, coming from where I'm from, I was raised on a farm, I was around tools and building things and that. I thought, man, maybe I could make one of those knives, even if it's just, something really crude, I could still flip it around. And so I talked to Richard Bastillo, and he loaned me his knife, and I took it home, and in a weekend I put a knife together that became my first bali song. And so my actual knife making started then because at that time there were other poor students also, and a couple of them said, hey Ernie, could you make me one of those knives too? And I said, well, if you pay for the aluminum and the steel, I'll make it. And those were made with a hacksaw, a file, and a acetylene torch, or a butane torch, and a hand drill. So they were crude, believe me, but it was the start of something that I found out later I absolutely loved to do, and that was really where it started.
And when was that, Ernie?
That had to be around 1979. Yep.
So, a little anecdote. We sat down with Bob Lovelace about 10 years ago, and he literally started about the same way that you did. He told us a story about how he took a cab to a junkyard and got a Packard spring and made a knife out of it. It's pretty cool, isn't it?
It's very cool. Let me tell you my two Bob Lovelace stories. I lived in a city here in Southern California called Lawndale, and this was probably 5 or 6 years before I decided before I made that knife at the Cali Academy. And I found out later, when Bob Lovelace moved out to Riverside, that he was 2 blocks away from where I was living when I was a 19-year-old kid out here, and I thought, holy mackerel, wouldn't that have been a deal if I had walked into his shop one day when I was a kid. My other Lovelace story is this. This was at this show, at the Costa Mesa show, when I was one of my very first knife shows I'd ever been to, and I was sitting next to Bob Lovelace because he was still attending shows. And what happened was Bob had his knives out on the table, and I'm sitting next to him, and I knew Bob was famous, but I didn't really know how famous, and I didn't really know Bob's personality, if you will. And this young man came up and said, wow, these are really, really nice knives. I'm really interested in them. How much are they? And Bob said, well, that knife's $700. And he was like, oh, man, that's a lot of money. I'm sorry, but I can't afford to buy something like that. And he walked away. And I'm kind of eavesdropping on this. And he came back about 45 minutes later, and he said, sir, I walked through the show and I saw a lot of knives that looked just like the knives you have sitting on the table here, but they're only $200 a piece. Why are your knives worth $700? And I mean, honest, I heard Bob say this. Bob looked at him and he said, son, he goes, my knives are only worth $200. But you see that name right there? That name's worth $500. So the whole knife's $700. And I thought, man, someday maybe, I don't know. But what a cool thing. You know, that guy had some you know what, and he was a crusty old guy, but man, he opened the door for custom knife making for all of us. I mean, really, think about it.
Sure. I mean, there's many stories, and not only that, and I know that from personal experience with you, Bob wasn't just a guy that opened up the doors for a lot of people. As arrogant and abrasive as he could appear, by the same token, if you called up Bob and you were sincere and humble, he would give you as much time as you needed, and he would also provide you with templates from his shop if you wanted to work in his style. And I know that there's a lot of makers that have credited you in the same token. And one of the things I wanted to touch on was the influence that Phil Hartsfield might have had on you.
Well, Phil was one of those guys, again, and I say this with all due respect, because I do respect it. He was cut from a different bolt of cloth. And he was his own man. I don't think he ever depended on anyone else for anything in regard to his knife making and all that. And you could see it in his work. In other words, you could recognize a Phil Hartsfield knife across the room because it was a Phil Hartsfield knife. It wasn't a, I mean, honest, I made some Bob Lovelace style knives when I started. But, you know, as far as Phil was concerned, everything he made was Phil Hartsfield. And I'll tell you the story. I was approached by some guys that, let's just say they identified themselves as underwater welders. And I found out later they weren't underwater welders, but that's another story. And what they did was they came to me and they said, Ernie, we would like to see if you could make a knife. We need to have these certain features on it, but we were wondering, because they had Phil Hartsfield's fixed blades. And Phil's knives were made of A2, I believe, at the time, was one of the steels he was using, and they were fixed blades. And these guys needed some knives that had that type of grind, which was the chisel grind, because at the time I think Phil was like the only guy in the world doing that in modern knives. And you know, it actually goes back a long, long ways, but sure. Phil was like the chisel grind guy. He was the man. And they showed me his knives, and I was like, holy smokes, I've never seen a knife that sharp in my life. I mean, it was scary sharp. And so I said, but you know what, that's Mr. Hartsfield's, that's his signature knife. So I said, I don't know about that, because I'm not gonna infringe on that or copy it or do anything like that, because that's just not who I was. And they said, well, we certainly would like you to do that if you could. So I thought, okay, I'll call Phil. And again, with all due respect, Phil is another one of those kind of short, curt, to the point, direct guys. And I called him and I told him who these knives were going to be for and what we were doing, and asked him if he would okay me to make a knife that had the chisel grind on it. And he said, you know, no one's ever asked me before this question. And he goes, if that's what you want to do, he goes, you go ahead and do it. I said, I'm not going to make fixed blades like yours and all that. Although subsequently in the furtherance of my knife career, I did make some chisel ground fixed blades. But I said, I'm really interested in making the folder. And it was the CQC6 knife, and Phil basically said it was okay, and so I was like, dang, he was another one of those iconic guys. I mean, as a young knife maker, guys like Lovelace, Hartsfield, people like that, those were the guys that I looked up to as knife makers supreme. And so it was a very cool thing, and again, the knife world suffered a great loss when Phil passed away, but he left a lasting legacy on me, absolutely, and I believe on all knife makers in general. I got to tell you a little story.
Sure.
One of my best friends, this is one of those, again, kind of odd stories. He was down in Georgia, and he came up to me at the Blade Show, and he goes, Ernie, I got to show you this knife. He goes, I was at a yard sale, and the lady was selling a bunch of stuff, and there was a knife in there, and he goes, I looked at it and I thought, wow, this is a cool knife. I asked her how much she wanted for it. She said $12. He pulled it out. He showed it to me. It was a Phil Hartsfield folder It was the one that had the two guards that went up on
Yeah.
each side. It was one of the original ones that he had made probably 30, 40 years ago.
Right.
And I said, "You got to be freaking kidding me. That's an original vintage Phil Hartsfield knife, and you paid $12 for it?" His knives were going for thousands of dollars at the time. I said, his name is Jason. I said, "Jason, you can never, ever, ever do anything but put that knife up on the mantle and keep it, because you got more." He didn't know what it was.
Right.
And I thought, wow, what a cool thing. So has Phil left a lasting legacy in the knife world? Yeah, he sure has.
Yeah, absolutely. There's many people that credit Phil for, as you said, the use of A2, his hardening, his heat treating, his grinding, his designs, many things. And I would say at this point in the knife history that we talk about, and I've often said that we're living knife history, as certainly in America as we move forward, starting in the 70s. Possibly moving up through now. So roughly 40 years of evolution has really changed the topography of knives in the world. What are some of the things that you've noticed, say, in the last, or in the time that since you in the 70s when you started, that have changed specifically in America with knife making?
Well, and they've been great changes too. So what I'm going to tell you is when I started back in the 70s, if you will, at that time there were only knife companies, and there were custom makers, but they were basically separated, because custom makers were like me, working out of a garage, making a half a dozen knives a year or maybe a couple dozen knives a year. And the knife companies were the only other venue that you could either buy a custom knife or you had to buy a factory knife, if you will. And what I saw happening over the time that I've been involved in the trade was, I mean, look around today. I think there's probably 100 or more, or maybe 200 knife companies out there that were started by guys like me who are custom makers and started a company and are now producing knives on a quote-unquote factory basis, or I don't like the term mass produce, because I don't think any of them mass produce their knives, but they've taken that step in evolution to use the technologies, use the machinery, use the designs that a custom maker can produce. And I mean, for gosh sakes, look at Rick Hinderer, look at all of these guys that are out there making these knives that in the past they were unavailable. You either had to buy a $1,000 custom knife or a $100 factory knife, and now those knives are out there that are in the $200 and $300, maybe $400 price range, where you can get a highly precise, machined, custom designed knife, and you can go ahead and buy one. You can buy it in a store, you can buy them online and take them home. And so I think to me, that's the biggest evolutionary steps that the industry has taken.
So you told us a couple funny stories. I'm going to tell you a funny story that I don't think you knew about. I had a knife business in Seattle, Washington called Hi Hat Knives. It was a retail shop, and I was the first Washington State from the factory Benchmade dealer. And I got to know Les Diasis very well. And I had my shop. It was about 1994, and Les was in town to see a Mariners game, and he brought his son John. John was a little kid. He was about 10 years old.
I remember.
And Les came into the shop and he said, "You remember what you told me about a year ago?" And I said, "Yeah, a year ago I told you Ernie Emerson wasn't a designer for you. He was a future competitor, and you just taught him everything he needed to know about his business." And he said, "You're right, you SOB."
Well, you know what? Let me tell you something. Les had a vision. Of course, the vision was to have a knife company, but he did something, I believe, that broke the ground for that evolutionary process that I was talking about.